Hi, I want to welcome you back to our third section in studying this question, do the adult children of an elder need to be faithful? Now, in the first section, we kind of introduced this question, and we talked about some of the controversy and some of the different ways that people look at the question. In the second one, what we did is we answered this question in no uncertain terms. And what we concluded was that yes, an elder's adult children must be faithful. And if you haven't seen those, you need to go back and watch them. Every study builds off of itself, so if you haven't done that, go back and watch them. Now, what we're going to do in this study is going to be a little bit different. Now, our task in this study is to answer common objections to the truth that, yes, even an elder's adult children must be faithful. Now, how we approach that is going to be the same as in the first two studies. We're going to first look at book, chapter, and verse. We're going to open up the Bible. It's not my opinion. It's not someone else's opinion, but book, chapter, and verse. And in looking at book, chapter, and verse, what we're going to do is we're going to rightly divide the word of truth, meaning we're going to use good, sound reasoning and logic. And in speaking that truth, we're going to do that with love. And so that means that we're not here to kind of drag people down or shame anyone. We just want to bring people back to the pattern. This is the pattern that God has given us. This is a pattern that we are going to follow. So that's our ultimate goal in this study. Now, what we've done in this study is we've taken the 10 most common objections to the truth, to the fact that an elder's adult children must be faithful, and we've answered all 10 of those objections with a book, chapter, and verse and sound logic. So this will be one of our longer studies. We'll try to get through it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But stick with us through this one. I think that this study will solidify the truth that an elder's children must be faithful. So let's jump into the first objection. The first and most common objection that I hear is that once an elder's children move out, they're no longer in his household. Now, I kind of coined this term and I've kind of coined this as the household exemption. And this is really the most common thing. This is the most common thing that you see. And really what people do is they build off of what we call the leave and cleave principle. And so what people say is building off of Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. It says, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So their point is that, once they move out, or once they become married, they are no longer part of their parents' home. The parents are no longer responsible for that child. Let's really evaluate this and see if this is true, and see if it is consistent and it really holds up. Our main thing that we need to look at here, and that we really need to see, is when we look at that word household, as we see used in 1 Timothy chapter 3, does it mean a physical home? Does it mean while the child is living under a physical structure? Or does it refer to a family? Does it refer to a family? And so here's really, when we look at this objection, kind of putting all of this together, what we need to look at is, does leaving and cleaving mean a child is no longer in the household of the father? That's really the true question when we're kind of breaking this objection down. So let's answer that question. And how we want to answer that, as we've already talked about, is with book, chapter, and verse. Now let's look at Noah and his household. It says, by Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, he prepared an ark for the saving of his household. That's Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. That word household is the same root word, same word used in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Now, when we look at the Old Testament account of this, where we really see this come from, is Genesis chapter 7 and verse 1. It says, the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household. Now, our question becomes, who was in the household? And it becomes very clear. It says, so Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went into the ark. So here we see Genesis chapter 2 talks about leaving and cleaving, right? We fast forward to Genesis chapter 7, and we see this household term. Noah's sons are married, but guess what? They're still considered to be part of Noah's household. Now, that's very important. Noah's married sons were still part of his household. Now, could that be consistent with 1 Timothy chapter 3? But let's dig into this a little bit further. Let's look at Eli and his household. Now, the full account is in 2 Samuel chapter 2. You can read the full account, but I'm going to sum it up for you. Eli's sons were priests. Now, priests were to be at least 25 years old. You can see that from Leviticus chapter 8, verse 24. And what we see with Eli's sons is that they did not worship the Lord properly, and they lay with women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle. They were committing fornication. Okay, you can see that in verses 12 through 17 and verse 22. And what we see with Eli rebuked his sons. That's all he did. He didn't go further than rebuking. He just rebuked. And his sons didn't listen to him. And this was what God had to say to Eli. God said to Eli, "Why do you kick at my sacrifice and my offerings which I have commanded in my dwelling place, and honor your sons more than me?" God was getting on Eli. He said, all you did is rebuke them. You didn't go beyond that. Because of that, you honor your sons more than you honor me. And here's what we see. He says, "Behold, the days are coming, that I will cut off your arm and the arm of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house, in your household." Now, here we see Eli's sons, they're priests, which means they're at least 25 years old. And God still considers Eli's sons to be part of his household. God considered Eli to be responsible for his sons. You honor your sons more than me. So Eli really did have responsibility for his children. He really should have taken control, and he really should have gone beyond rebuking his children. Let's continue. Let's look at Job and his household. Job chapter 1. You can read the full account. In verse 10, this is Satan speaking, and Satan says, "Have you not made a hedge around him," talking about Job, "around his household and around all that he has on every side?" Satan is saying, you've made this hedge around Job, and you've protected all that he has, including his family, right? Excluding his sons and daughters. And so the chapter continues, and it says, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came." So what do we see with Job chapter 1? Satan is groaning that you've protected his household. And God says, you know what? You can destroy all that he has, including his household. You just can't destroy him. You can't kill him. And what do we see? Job's sons and daughters were old enough to have their own physical home, but they were still considered to be part of Job's household. Now let's continue through the Bible. Let's look at what Jesus has to say about household. Matthew chapter 10. What Jesus says, verses 35 and 36. "For I have come to set man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household." Now, I really want you to consider in-laws in this text. What we see is that the cause of Christ would cause a daughter-in-law to be divided from her mother-in-law. And so what we see is Jesus says that a man's enemies will be those of his own household. And Jesus is referring to in-laws as being in the same household. You see, we're building this. We're going through the Bible. Now we're even all the way to Jesus, and Jesus considers household is more than just a physical structure. Jesus is saying household is family, married family, in-laws, not that. Let's continue. Let's look at Peter and household, Acts chapter 2. we know the first gospel sermon, we're very familiar with it. It says, therefore let all of the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. Verse 36. Now, consider that term house of Israel. When we're talking about house of Israel, is that a physical house? Or is that a family? Well, of course, he's talking about a family, a spiritual family, a lineage, not a physical structure. Not a physical structure. Let's continue. Let's look at Paul and household. Galatians chapter 6. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. That's Galatians 6:10. Now, let's consider this. Is household of faith a physical house or a spiritual family? Spiritual family, right? The church isn't comprised of a building. It's a spiritual family. Let's continue. Paul and household in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Now, to me, this is one of the most useful and to me the most mind-changing ways to kind of reframe how we think about this term household as we see it in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Now again, this is Paul writing in 1 Timothy chapter 5, just a few chapters separated. Here's what Paul has to say about household. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and repay their parents. But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially those of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, to me, that's pretty influential. Paul is saying that your grandmother, your mother, is part of your household. Now, some people will kind of rebut that and say, well, they all lived in the same house. Okay, now let's consider that for a second. If that's true, if my grandmother lived in a separate house, I wouldn't be responsible for her. I don't have to take care of her because she lives in a separate house. You see, when we really look at the Bible and household, it really paints a different picture than we've painted within the church. Here's our problem, I think. It's our 21st century American culture. Due to our individualism and segmentation, we have lost our concept of household and desire to follow the patriarch of the family. We really want to be individuals, not be part of this larger household, and have a man who's leading our family. So let's go back to the text. Now, we talked about a lot of different verses throughout the Bible. And I want us to remember that, first of all, the text is talking about right now. So one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. That means right now, the man is to have faithful children in submission with all reverence. It is not one who ruled his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. It's one who is ruling his own house well. So, I just kind of sum up this objection. Again, the objection is that once an elder's children move out, or they get married, they're no longer part of his household. But when we really look at the text, and we really look at that term household, Eli's married sons were still part of his household. Eli's sons, still part of his household. Job's sons, who were old enough to have their own homes, were still part of his household. Jesus said that in-laws would be part of your household. Paul says that your grandparents and your mother are part of your household, and you have a responsibility to take care of them. So when we look at the text, Paul's not talking about a physical structure over somebody and saying that, well, once they move out of that physical structure, you're no longer responsible for them, and therefore you're exempt from having faithful children. That's not what Paul says. Even when your children get married, as in the case of Noah, even when children move out, case of Job, Eli, they're still part of your household. And therefore what we see is that this objection is really false. it really doesn't hold water. Because, again, household is not a physical structure. Household is a family, is a family unit, and should be led by a patriarch, should be led by a man who's leading his household. And so if an elder is not doing that at the present time, then he would not be qualified. Now, let's go into our second objection, which is very similar to this. Our second objection states this: an elder's children are only required to be faithful when they are living in a man's home. Okay, so let's dig into this a little bit. Now, there are a lot of supporters of this position. However, I think the thing that we need to point out is that when supporters are presented with specific cases, they're not consistent and do not fully support this position that children only need to be faithful inside the home. Okay, so let's look at this. Now, here's our first scenario to show that it's really hard to be consistent with this position, that children only need to be faithful while they're under the parent's roof. Here's a scenario that I personally have encountered. This is not some hypothetical or made-up scenario. A man has children in his early 20s. In his early 40s, the man becomes a Christian after his children have moved out of the home. This means that the man did not raise his children in a Christian home, and his children were not Christians upon leaving home. Now, later in life, the man converts one of his several children to Christianity, and then in his 60s, the man decides and desires to become an elder. So here's our question: is this man qualified? Now, if your position is that an elder must have faithful children and his children must be faithful while they live under his roof, then you would have to say this man is not qualified because his children were not faithful when they lived under his roof. And you forever disqualify this man. There's nothing that this man could do because he does not have a time machine to go and go back and raise his children in a Christian home. Now, what is the consistent position? I believe the consistent position would be to look at the man at the present time, as the text says, having right now and ongoing faithful children, right? We look at the man right now. So if all of his children were faithful, then this man would be qualified. Now let's look at another scenario. A man has two children. One of the children, before leaving home, denies Christianity and leaves the home in a state of unfaithfulness. Now, is this man qualified? Now, based on this position, if the man's child left home in a state of unfaithfulness, then he's not qualified because his children were not faithful while they were in his home. You see, it becomes very hard to stay consistent with this position. Additionally, as in the previous case, this man would be forever disqualified because his children were not faithful while they were under his roof. So we disqualify this man forever. There's nothing he can do to become qualified because his children were not faithful while they were in his home. Let's look at one more scenario. What about unfaithful adult children that move in with their parents? Now, most state that they're adults so they don't count, even though they live under the physical roof. But it raises a good question. They live under the man's roof. Why would they not apply to it, right? If this is your position. And what about college students? Most college students come home during breaks and have their parents' address listed as their primary residence. So are they considered part of his household or not part of his household? Do they count against him? Do they not count against him? You see, the problem with this position is that it's not consistent. And if a position is not consistent, then it has to be false. Consistency is key. You can't take this position and say, you know what, an elder must have his children faithful while they live under his roof, but they don't count when they go to college, and they don't count if they're adults. And that we have to reconcile, we have to understand that if a man had children that left home in a state of unfaithfulness, that man's forever disqualified. You have to accept that. I don't know many people that are doing it. So ultimately, when we look at this position, an elder's children are only required to be faithful when they are living under the man's roof, we see that it's false because it's not consistent. It's just not consistent. Now let's continue. This is our third objection. Probably the third most common objection that I hear is that only a majority of an elder's children must be faithful. But let's really dive into this. Here's a scenario, and this is often the scenario I see presented. People say, well, what if a man has 10 children? What percentage or how many of those children need to be faithful for the man to be qualified? And what people often do is they advocate, well, the man should have a better success than fail rate. In other words, he needs to have 50% or more of his children faithful. And I believe that those who take this approach are trying to be fair and reasonable and practical. Let's really look at this scenario. First of all, the majority rule, as I like to call it, he needs to have he needs to have a majority of his children faithful, is really not fair. It's not consistent because a man with one child would have to have a 100% success rate. A man with two children would still need to have a 100% success rate. Because if he's going to have a better pass than fail rate, if he has one faithful and one unfaithful, that's 50%. That's not a majority. That's a break even. Now, a man had 3 children, he would need to have a 66% success rate. A man with 4 children, a 75% success rate. And a man with 10 children would have a 60% success rate. You see, people will try to say, well, this is counter-practical, it's reasonable, but it's not fair. Because many people are going to have different success rates that are applied depending on how many children they have. And I don't believe that's fair. I don't believe that's fair at all, and I don't believe you see it in the text. Now, if a majority of an elder's children were required to be faithful, when would this apply? Would it apply in the home, out of the home, or both? Let's look at this a little bit. Now, again, coming to the majority rule, he has to have a better pass than fail rate, or success than fail rate. If it only applied out of the home, this would be the scenario. So while the children are living under the father's roof, all the children must meet the qualifications, as we see on the left side of the arrow there, right? All of the man's children must be faithful while they're living under his roof. But after the children move out, they're no longer living under his roof, only some or majority of them would be required to be faithful. Now, there's a few reasons why this doesn't work. Number one, the qualification I'm talking about right now. This includes whether they live under the father's roof or not. Nothing in the text changes the qualifications for when the children are living under the roof and then not living under the roof. And so what this approach does is it creates one set of rules when the children are in the father's home, and then another set when they're out of his home or no longer living under his roof. We see that that's just unreasonable. Totally unreasonable. And so people, after they realize that this approach, that majority rules only applies out of the home, kind of try a different approach because this one doesn't work. And so a lot of people will say, well, the majority rule applies both in the home and out of the home. So what people say is, well, an elder just needs to have some of his children faithful while they're in the home, and then some of his children, or majority of his children, faithful when they're out of the home. The problem with this is essentially you are allowing an elder to have disobedient, unruly, unfaithful children while they live under his roof. I think we can all agree that if a man cannot lead his children to be faithful, especially when they are living under his roof, can it be said that he's managing his house well? I don't see how that can be said. So what we see is that the approach before this, that majority rule only applies outside the home, is inconsistent. This approach that majority rule applies in the home and out of the home allows an elder to just have unruly children while they're living under his roof. That doesn't work. There's only one more option. And that option is this. Majority rule doesn't apply at all. And this is the only consistent, only logical approach. And that is that a man must have all of his children meet the qualifications. It means that his children must be in submission with all reverence. They must be faithful, whether they're in the home or out of the home. And a man must have this if he's going to be serving or qualified to be an elder. So ultimately what we see is that we come back to this question. If a majority of an elder's children are required to be faithful, when would it apply? It wouldn't. It can't apply because the majority rule is found nowhere in the text, and it creates logical issues. We have to remember a very important principle that's laid out in God's Word. That you can find it in Revelation chapter 22, Deuteronomy chapter 4, and chapter 12, Proverbs chapter 30. And that principle is this. You can't add to, and you can't take away from God's Word. Now we need to ask ourselves, what does the text say? What does the text say? Does the text say, one who rules his own house well, having some of his children in submission with all reverence? It's not what the text says. Does the text say, one who rules his own house well, having a majority of his children in submission with all reverence? That's not what the text says. Does the text say, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence? It's exactly what the text says. And we see that word, his children, that's however many children he has. If he has 10 children and he has one child, his children need to be in submission with all reverence. That is what the text says. It doesn't say a majority of his children. It doesn't say a majority of his children when they're out of the home or in the home or whatever the case is. The text is very clear. His children must be faithful, presently and ongoing, if he's going to be an elder. He's going to be qualified to be an elder. So what do we see with this? This objection is false. Now, our next objection, I think, is a quick one. But some people advocate, well, the qualifications are only for appointment to be an elder. Well, let's really dive into this. We have to remember that the text is talking about right now. One who rules his own house well, having, it's presently and ongoing. We covered that in the second study of this, having his children in submission with all reverence. It is not one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence at appointment. It's not what the text says. It's having his children faithful, in submission with all reverence now. Not an appointment. It's not what it says. And if that's true, if it's true that the qualifications are only for appointment, then we have to ask ourselves this question. Then the day after the appointment, the man can be the husband of 3 wives and he's still qualified? Well, no. A man can be given to wine the day after appointment? Well, no. The man can be a striker, greedy, impatient, a brawler, covetous, and not rule his own house well after appointment? Well, no. We would say that if a man is committing adultery while serving as an elder, but at appointment he wasn't, we understand that means no longer qualified. And that goes for all of the qualifications. They're all presently and ongoing. The man needs to be meeting these qualifications the entire time to be qualified. So ultimately, the qualifications are only for appointment to be an elder. This objection is false. It just doesn't work. It's not consistent. It's not logical. Our next objection, and I've heard people bring up, is that God had unfaithful children. Therefore, it's okay for an elder to have unfaithful children. And I do not believe this holds water at all. The objection is based on these few facts. It's based on the facts that the Israelites were God's children, and Christians are God's children. And some of the Israelites become unfaithful, and some Christians become unfaithful. And so the claim is that since God has unfaithful children, it is permissible for an elder to have unfaithful children. Now, the main issue with this objection is that we're comparing apples to oranges. You know, if we say we have 2 pieces of fruit, and they both grow on a tree, and therefore we say, well, it's just the same fruit, that would not be the case, right? Let's continue this comparison. Let's say, well, God does not have an earthly wife, therefore it's okay for an elder not to have a wife. Is that true? No. Well, what if we say, well, Jesus didn't have physical children on earth, therefore it's okay for an elder not to have children. Is that true? No. Right? We're not comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges. Here's the issue. To compare God in heaven with the qualifications of human men on earth is not an equal comparison. The reality is that even Jesus was not qualified to be an elder when he was here on earth. But that doesn't mean we get to change the qualifications for elders. And some people will say, well, it's just not fair. God had unfaithful children. Why can't an elder? I'll say this. You're going to have to take that one up with God. God wrote the qualifications, and he wrote them very specifically. And so if you have a problem with that, you will have to take that up with God. But here's what I will tell you. God has only one begotten Son, and that one Son was perfect and sinless. Again, when we look at this comparison, when we say, well, God had unfaithful children, therefore an elder can, it's just not apples to apples. And because of that, this objection is also false. Another objection people bring up is that, well, we cannot hold a father accountable for the sins of his children. And it's really based off of Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 20. It says, the soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. And while that's true, they're kind of taken out of context. So what we really need to do here is we really need to examine the verse in Ezekiel, and we need to examine Titus chapter 1 and verse 6, and say, are they really being used in the same sense? Are they saying the same thing? And really what we see is that the verses aren't saying the same thing. The point that's being made in Ezekiel is that a man is not going to be eternally responsible for the sins that his child commits. And really that a parent's not going to hell because of the sins that their child committed, and vice versa. A son is not going to hell for the sins that his father committed. So here's how we harmonize these two things. We're not holding a man responsible for the sins of his children, especially when we're talking about elders. We're not saying, well, your child sinned, and your child is unfaithful, therefore you're going to hell. That's not what we're saying. But what we are doing is looking at the text and saying, we are holding you responsible for the faithfulness of your children if you want to serve to be an elder. Those are not the same thing. We're not eternally holding a man responsible for the sins of his children, but we are making sure that his children are faithful, and he meets qualifications of an elder if he wants to do so. So ultimately, when we look at this objection, we cannot hold a father accountable for the sins of his children. We have to conclude that this objection is invalid. It's invalid because the statement is true, that we cannot hold a father accountable for the sins of his children in eternal judgment. That's a true statement. But it would be invalid to use that to say that a man can have unfaithful children and still be qualified to be an elder. Now, as we continue on, this is an objection that I've heard quite often, and it goes something like this. The qualifications for elders are qualities, not qualifications. And so what people are really trying to do is they're trying to take specific, very specific qualifications and make them general qualities. So let me give you some examples. They change husband of one wife to a man who has had the experience of being married. Well, that's not the same thing. Or they change husband of one wife to a man that has a demeanor of being a one-woman man. So they take a qualification, it's a hard qualification, they make it a quality. Let's look at another example. Some people will change, when talking about the context we're in right now, having faithful children, they change that to a man who has had the experience of raising children. Or they change it to a man who's a good father. Or I've even heard it put this way. A man that has the stuff to take people to heaven. Well, those are not the same things, right? Having faithful children is a hard qualification, and you can't boil it down into these kind of general vague qualities. So let's really look at these two words, quality and qualification. A quality is an attribute or characteristic possessed by somebody. And a qualification is a quality or accomplishment that makes someone qualify or be eligible for something. So what you see is that a qualification can include a quality, okay? So let's look at some real world examples. Let's step away from the Bible and kind of the context we're in at the moment. Let's say that you apply to be a bus driver. And that job description states must be a good driver. Now, is it a quality or is it a qualification? This is a quality that must be possessed by the applicant. But since it must be possessed, it's also a qualification for the job. So in this case, it's both a quality and it's a qualification because you must be a good driver to be the bus, to obtain the job of the bus driver. But let's change this around a little bit. Let's say that you look at the job description and it says, must possess a current driver's license. Is this a quality or a qualification? Well, it's actually only a qualification only. It's not a quality to possess a driver's license. That's not a quality. It's a qualification. You either have it or you don't. It's either a yes or a no. You have a driver's license or you don't have a driver's license. Now, let's apply this to elders. A man desires to be an elder. If you look at the qualification, it says an elder must be a man. Now, is being a man a quality or a qualification? Ultimately, it's a qualification only. It's not a quality. Now, you can have manly qualities, but you're either a man or you're not a man. So either a yes or a no. Now, let's look at husband of one wife. A man desires to be an elder. Look at the qualifications. It says a man must be the husband of one wife. Is this a quality or a qualification? Well, it's a qualification only. It's not a quality. It's either a yes or a no. You either are the husband of one wife or you are not the husband of one wife. It's not, well, he had the experience of being married or he acts like a one-woman man or whatever the case is. No, you're either married or you're not. Now let's look at what we're talking about here with children. An elder must be a man that has faithful children. Now, is this a quality or a qualification? This is a qualificational. It's not a quality. The man is either yes, or the man either yes has faithful children or he does not. His children are either faithful or they're not. It's not a quality. And you can't boil this down into something that is vague. You can't say, well, he had the experience of raising children or he's a good father or a good daddy. That's not the same thing. Ultimately, here's what we need to recognize. Any attempt to take specific qualifications and make them general qualities is changing the Word of God. That's ultimately what it is. So when we look at this, the qualifications for elders are qualities, not qualifications. This is false. This will not get you around the fact that an elder must have faithful children. Here's another objection that we hear, and that's that children are only children as long as they're living in the parent's home. Ultimately, this objection is false. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 4 says this, "But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and repay their parents." And here's our question. If a widow no longer has children once they move out, once they're no longer under her roof, who's supposed to care for her? You see, this objection ultimately doesn't work. Paul understands that children are always going to be children. He refers to them as such. Therefore, at a quick glance, this objection that children are only children as long as they live in a parent's home, Paul directly says that that's false. Children are always children. This objection is false. Now, this one, I didn't put specifics on it because there are so many emotional situations that people like to bring up. And so this is an insert emotional situation here type of objection. And what people like to do is they like to say, well, this terrible thing happened to this man, or this terrible situation is occurring with this man. And they say, well, because of that, this man's qualified. Because of this emotional, tragic situation, this man should be an elder. But you must remember one very important thing. Emotion is not doctrine. Let me say that one more time. Emotion is not doctrine. The reality is that we can create many, many emotional situations. Let's look at a few. What if someone was involved in a fatal car crash on the way to be baptized? Well, you know what? That is a tragic scenario. And I'll say, I hope that this person would be saved. I want them to be saved. But that does not allow me to change what Jesus said in Mark chapter 16 and verse 16, where he said that he who believeth and is baptized shall be saved. I can't change those words. Emotion's not doctrine. What if someone was involved in an adulterous 30-year marriage and they had children together? Could we say, well, because this marriage is so long and had children together, you know what, they can just stay in that marriage and they're okay? I can't say that. That's a terrible situation. I feel for this couple and this marriage. I feel for the children. But emotion's not doctrine. I can't change God's word on marriage, divorce, and remarriage and say their marriage is okay. Again, these situations do not allow us to change doctrine. And when we try to make up an emotional situation, we need to ask ourselves some questions. First of all, how many people does this really affect? We can try to bring up a scenario with marriage, divorce, and remarriage, or a tragic situation that happened with an elder, and really say, is this really an exception? Are we trying to create an exception? And really, how many people does it really affect? And we need to ask ourselves, should we be using fringe scenarios to justify our approach or doctrine? Let me say that again. Should we be using fringe scenarios to justify our approach or doctrine? Ultimately, no. And also, we need to ask ourselves, what is the end goal of bringing up this emotional situation? Are we trying to justify somebody's adulterous marriage? Are we trying to qualify a man who's really not qualified? So ultimately, what do we take away from this? That emotional situation is really invalid. Applying an emotional situation to an elder and his qualifications does not allow us to change God's word and say, you know what, this man's qualified because of this terrible, tragic, emotional situation. Now, our last objection is this. But I left it for last because it's very important. And the objection goes like this. A child cannot submit to their father once they are married. And again, we talked about this early on in this section, that the leave and cleave principle. A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Right? Talked about the leave and cleave principle. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 22 says, wives, submit to your own husbands. And so what people do is they say, well, once a wife or once a couple is married, they can't submit to their parents anymore. And so they can't be in submission with all reverence to their father who's an elder. That's the objection that's raised. Well, let's really look at this. We really need to look at submission and obedience in the Bible. Now, we are to submit to a lot of things. First of all, we're to submit to God. We're to submit to every ordinance of man. That's the government. The younger are supposed to submit to the elder. Wives are to submit to their husbands. And 1 Peter talks about the church, everyone submitting to each other. Also, we need to talk about obey or obedience. Right? We're supposed to obey those who teach us and rule over us, the elders. We're to obey the doctrine that was delivered to us. We're to obey the truth. Children are to obey their parents, and servants are to obey their masters. Now, keeping all of that in mind, can a wife submit to the government? Well, you would have to say yes, a wife can submit to the government. Can a wife submit to her supervisor? Well, yeah, a wife can submit to her supervisor. Can a wife submit to the elders of a congregation? Well, yes. Then here's our question. Then why can't she submit to her father? You see, what people try to do is they try to say, well, a wife can't submit to her father because she has to submit to her husband. That would be ignoring all of the other scriptures on submission and obedience. A wife can submit to the government, sure. A wife can submit to a supervisor at work within appropriate bounds, right? A supervisor doesn't get to tell you how to run your house. The supervisor doesn't get to tell you what to do when you're off the clock. And a wife can submit to the elders of the church. So if she can submit to the elders of the church, she can submit to the supervisor, and she can submit to the government, she can surely submit to her father. Again, looking at this chart, she can submit to all these things. And what we need to understand, there are layers in submission to obedience, in submitting, right? We ultimately submit to God first, highest. Everything else comes after that. And what we must not do is we must not take this to the extreme. Because that's what many do. Many will go to the extreme and say a married daughter cannot be making her father dinner and doing his chores, and mowing his lawn, and doing all this stuff for him. That's what they consider submission and obedience, right? But we have to look at what the text says. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. What does in the Lord mean? With things that pertain to religion in the appropriate realm. Continue that. And fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. So if we think that proper submission is being at your father's beck and call and doing all of his chores and doing everything for him, that's not really what the Bible's talking about. Because number one, that father would be provoking their child to wrath. And number two, that father really doesn't have any authority in the Lord. Say, hey, you need to be over here making my dinner, mowing my lawn, doing all my chores. That's not what it's talking about. The father needs to understand, she has her own home to take care of. But in the Lord, if I tell her, hey, you need to be at church. Hey, you need to be not sinning. You need to be following God. That's the submission that we're talking about to her father. And I want you to zoom out. Let's zoom out and take a look at the big picture here. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17. Obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give an account. Let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. What are we talking about here? We're talking about elders. Now, Hebrews chapter 13 verse 17. What do we learn? Christians are commanded to submit to the elders of a local congregation of which they attend. Okay? If I attend a congregation that has elders, I'm supposed to submit to them. Now, again, we're looking at the big picture here. If the children, no matter the age, old, young, the children of a man being considered for the eldership, do not submit to him, why would the adult Christians of a local congregation submit to him? That's the big picture here. If this man's own children, whom he's raised from birth in his own home, don't submit to him, why would I as an adult submit my soul and the care of my soul to this man? I hope that hits home. And I hope we realize that this objection, that a child cannot submit to their father once they're married, is ultimately false. A wife, a husband can submit to their father in the appropriate realm. They should be submitting to him in the Lord, especially if he is considered to be an elder. They should be submitting to this man appropriately. So what we see is ultimately this objection is false. This is the conclusion of our third study. It's probably a lot. It was one of our longer studies, and we knew that going into it. I ask you to comment, like, subscribe, pass it on. That's how people will see this type of content. You can also contact me if you have questions, you want to talk about this, at BibleAnswersBibleQuestions@gmail.com. Again, BibleAnswersBibleQuestions@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you in our last study.